Hello and welcome to another episode, this time an English-speaking episode at 99 zu 1, 99 to 1. Today we are here with Vincent Bevins. It's a huge honor to have you here, Vincent, author of the Jakarta Method, Washington's Anticommunist Crusade, the mass murder program that shaped our world. Vincent Bevins is currently here in Berlin and in Germany in order to present the German edition that just got translated at Papyrossa Verlag. Here we got one exemplar of it. He's presenting it those days tonight in Berlin, but we're going to publish the episode later on. Vincent Bevins is an award-winning journalist and correspondent. He served in London for the Financial Times, then in Brazil for the Los Angeles Times, and recently for the Washington Post in Indonesia as correspondent. And he was raised and born in California and spent the last few years there in Jakarta, where he wrote this very important book. It's such a pleasure to have you here, Vincent.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I mean, you have already been a very successful journalist, but why did you write this book?
So yeah, I mean, actually, there's not that many successful journalists left. So I would say that I had been surviving as a correspondent over the years. I went to Southeast Asia in 2017 to cover all of Southeast Asia for the Washington Post. But then, I mean, that was not guaranteed success. Like I was supposed to maybe get the full-time job doing that. But it wasn't guaranteed. But what I found when I got there, and my job was really just to write sort of mainstream news for a large corporate newspaper in the United States, I found that whatever I was trying to do, whatever contemporary story I was trying to report on, in Indonesia especially, but throughout Southeast Asia, this big untold and unresolved story really sort of lurks below the surface no matter where you looked. Like you couldn't really do the job of a correspondent telling the story of contemporary Southeast Asia without looking at this big trauma of 1965 and the way that it was still sort of haunting politics in the country. So I set aside sort of full-time correspondent duties, and I wrote a book proposal, and the publishers were interested. And then I decided just to do nothing else but this for several years. And the way that I came at this project, rather than just looking at it from an Indonesian angle, was to take a really global focus and particularly try to draw connections to Latin America, which is where I had sources, and I knew the languages, and I knew the Cold War history fairly well. So I spent 3 years doing that. And sort of the closer and closer I looked at this massacre in 1965, the more I came to the conclusion that it was really one of the most pivotal events of the 20th century.
Yeah, and many people don't know a lot about it. But what means Jakarta Method?
Yeah, so the Jakarta Method is the intentional mass murder of leftists or people accused of being leftists in the second half of the 20th century in the global South. I found in this book that in at least 23 cases, this type of intentional mass murder was carried out, usually with some degree of assistance from Western powers, United States being the most important in the Cold War, often other Western powers such as West Germany. Sometimes that support was very explicit and material. Sometimes it was more implicit. And it's called the Jakarta Method. Well, the reason Jakarta Method is really a term that we come up with as a translation of several terms in Spanish and Portuguese. You have Operação Jakarta, Operation Jakarta in Brazilian Portuguese. You have Jakarta or Plan Jakarta in both Chile and Central America. And the reason this term is employed by right-wing movements, allies of the United States, in those countries is because they looked at what happened in 1965 in Indonesia. They looked at the intentional mass murder of approximately 1 million leftists or accused leftists, and they were inspired by it. They saw it as something that they could do in their own countries, and that if they did it in their own countries, the Western powers would reward them for doing so. They turned out to be right on both counts. They could do it. It did work, and they were rewarded by major Western powers with economic and diplomatic support.
Yeah. So in your book, you called the not existing memory and general knowledge a black box. How can it be that so many people, including probably most of our viewers, don't know a lot about those terrible anti-communist and anti-leftist massacres?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And to answer it, I think you need to come up with several reasons. Because as you point out, a lot of people really don't know about this these days. However, at the time, in 1965, if you were paying attention in the Cold War, this was a very big deal. This was the extermination of the largest communist party outside of China and the Soviet Union. It was probably the largest unarmed socialist movement in human history. And basically overnight, Indonesia went from being a left-leaning, founding and influential member of the Third World Movement to a radical anti-communist state allied with the West in the Cold War. So this was a very big deal at the time. And so to start to explain how it could be forgotten so completely, especially in the global north, in countries like Germany and the United States, I think you have to start, one, with the degree to which the Suharto dictatorship was really successful in unleashing terror and insisting that its version of history was the only one. So after 1965, the new dictatorship that took over and became the most important ally of the West in Southeast Asia really made it very dangerous to tell the truth about what had happened. So the propaganda version created by the Suharto dictatorship in 1966 remains the official version in Indonesia to this day. It is illegal to tell this kind of a story. So technically still defense of any kind of Marxist movement is a criminal offense. And people were really terrified into silence about the truth. I think reason number two was the Vietnam War. So even though Indonesia is larger and more important than Vietnam, even though everyone in the US foreign policy establishment in the early 1960s agreed that Indonesia was far more important than Vietnam in the Cold War, Vietnam, because it's not a success for the United States, starts to become a domestic political issue. American soldiers are dying. This is a quagmire. And those of us in the West, but especially the United States, we have limited attention for faraway countries in Asia. And I think that Vietnam really dominated popular ideas of what was going on in the Cold War in Asia because it lasted 10 years and it was a real mess. Whereas Indonesia happened very quickly, very quietly. There was basically no cost, at least to Western states. Of course, the cost in Indonesia was horrifying. And then finally, and I think this is sort of the toughest one to wrap our heads around, but I think that the importance of this story and what really happened in Indonesia in 1965, both of these elements are so contradictory to our idea of what globalization was. They contradict so forcefully sort of mainstream popular ideas about how the Cold War ended and how the US-led global capitalist order came into be, that it's simply easier just to forget about it. It's too difficult to confront. It too violently clashes with the stories that we tell. So it was easier just to put it over here. And this was kind of the response that I got from conservative outlets in the United States. People didn't come out, the segments in US society that were never going to like this book, they didn't come and say that it was wrong. They just didn't want to talk about it. Yeah. This tends to be the narrative on the right wing about CIA abuses in the early Cold War. It's not, you can't go back and say, well, this, the evidence proves something else happened. It's just better not to talk so much about that stuff.
And there was it was a Cold War. So during Cold War, how was the divide of the international order? Can we have a look at geopolitics? Which blocks kind of build up?
Yeah, and that's how I choose to start the book. I think the best place to start this story is in 1945, when the United States emerges from World War II as by far the most powerful country in the world. We look back and we think, oh, there's two superpowers. It wasn't even close. The United States was far, far more powerful than the Soviet Union, and it had occupied, often literally, so physically, this area would have been occupied a position in the global system that had been created by hundreds of years of Western European formal colonialism. So the United States comes out of World War II as this relatively young but now very powerful country sitting at the top of a world system created by hundreds of years of imperial plunder and Western European domination. But Western Europe has destroyed itself in World War II. Soviet Union has essentially been destroyed by World War II as well. And the United States looks out on this world order and doesn't know exactly how to approach it. The United States, unlike Britain, for example, or unlike France, does not have the kind of globally active secret services and intelligence agencies and spy networks that formal colonial powers had built up over centuries. The United States always had two kind of competing tendencies within its national character. There was always this idea that technically, officially, we stood for anti-colonial and revolutionary ideals. It's a republic founded in a revolutionary war, but at the same time, it's a republic that was founded in a revolutionary war and then immediately conquered all of North America through genocide and imperialist aggression. So, looking out on the Cold War, a lot of leaders in what we now call the Global South didn't really know how to interact with the U.S. A lot of these leaders hoped that the U.S. would sort of remain faithful to the first vision, to a sort of anti-colonial, democratic idea of a global order. And even the U.S. didn't quite know. And this was when the CIA was created after World War II. The CIA knew from the beginning what it was supposed to do with the Second World. The CIA knew how it was supposed to interact with countries like the Soviet Union, and all of the other nations in Moscow's orbit. But the early CIA didn't really know what they were supposed to do in the Third World, and they didn't really know much about it. And even the most sort of optimistic and sympathetic, the most sympathetic and enthusiastic historians of the CIA admit this. They didn't really know what to do in the Third World. And I should stress, because I'll probably use this term a bunch of times as I always do, that the Third World movement at this moment was an entirely positive mission. It was a forward-looking, optimistic project carried out, led by the countries of Africa and Asia and Latin America that were often either still fighting to free themselves from colonial control or that had just achieved independence from colonial control. And the Third World Movement was this idea that they would reconfigure, reconstruct the global order along truly decolonial lines. And so the CIA enters the Cold War not really knowing what to do in much of the Third World. And Indonesia is a perfect example of this. Indonesia, one of the most important countries in the Third World Movement, and now the fourth largest country in the world by population, sat right on this line. The US didn't quite know how to interact with Indonesia at the beginning of the Cold War.
So how did they interact with Indonesia and other third world countries back in those days? How did they kind of, on one hand, fight against communism and on the other hand, kind of impose their national interests?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this story that I've just outlined, this sort of uncertainty in the late 40s and early 1950s changes in 1953 and 1954 in Iran and Guatemala. The young CIA succeeds in overthrowing two governments in those countries that, in both cases, there are economic interests that are important to the United States and Britain in the case of Iran. And in both cases, you could kind of pretend, or you could kind of tell yourself that the left was too strong, that these countries were too friendly to socialist forces around the world. But in neither case was communism ever, there was no chance that communism was about to win in Iran in 53 or Guatemala in 54. And so after this, in 1955, Indonesia becomes a country that the CIA believes that it should intervene in. It believes that the particular type of Indonesia that is forming in these years in the Cold War is no longer acceptable. And it makes this decision for two reasons. One, President Sukarno puts on the Bandung Conference in 1955. Bandung, a city in Java, which really brings together the Third World Movement for the first time as a formal movement. And then the Indonesian Communist Party, the moderate, unarmed Communist Party, which has been active in the anti-colonial struggle back to the early 20th century. It's the oldest Communist Party in Asia, starts to win more and more votes in elections. So what the CIA tries first is to import a tactic that worked well in Italy, which was to simply give money to a competing party. They just funneled a bunch of money to a conservative Muslim party. This did not work. So in 1958, they try something else. They foment, they encourage, and then they participate in a civil war. CIA pilots are bombing Indonesia, taking the side of rebel forces, trying to break up the country, and they are caught doing that. So you really see over several years, several different attempts to try different things in Indonesia, and the first of these are failures.
Yeah, so back in those days, anti-communism was the key ideology in the United States. Can you explain us the importance of anti-communism and the role of McCarthy, because then they called it McCarthyism? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that if you want to understand U.S. foreign policy in this era, you can think basically about two combined forces, which is global McCarthyism, this sort of export of a radical anti-communist ideology on the global stage, and also the old classic need to accumulate capital, right? Like U.S. business interests were important, so were the geopolitical concerns about holding back the Soviet Union and socialism globally. Now, why does the United States become such a rapidly anti-communist force in this era? Again, there's two answers. Historian Eric Hobsbawm says at one point somewhere in one of his works that the deep-seated U.S. ideology has always been from the beginning something like the opposite of communism. It's really about individualism and private property, and it's a country founded on sort of showing up in a piece of land and taking stuff and converting it into private property. But then also there's geopolitical competition. The Soviet Union offered an alternative path to modernity for the peoples of the world. This was a direct geopolitical rival. So McCarthy, Senator McCarthy, carried out a kind of a purge of the U.S. political system with the assistance of the FBI. And by the end of McCarthyism, you didn't have very many people left in the U.S. state that were not radical anti-communists. So everyone in the State Department that kind of understood Asia was often purged because they were considered to be too sympathetic to communism. It really created a state which only had a certain type of ideology in it, McCarthyism. But there are also, rational economic and geopolitical reasons to treat everything that smelled a little bit like the Soviet Union as a threat. Yeah, in 1954, you have Jacobo Arbenz, who is not a socialist. He's not a communist. He says, and he claims, this is what he says, and I think it makes sense to believe him, that he wanted to carry out essentially a liberal revolution. He wanted to help Guatemala make the transition from feudalism to capitalism. And this was a really perverse consequence of U.S. policy in Latin America in the Cold War. Often we ended up being sort of held back the liberal revolution rather than just opposing the socialist revolution. So Arbenz is overthrown in 1954. Che Guevara is in Guatemala. Arbenz initially, and this is a story that you see throughout the Cold War, Arbenz initially thinks that it's kind of going to be fine. Coups have been happening all the time in Central America for a very long time. The U.S., when they make their interests clear, often that means that a government is going to be overthrown. But the left wants the part of the left that Che Guevara is involved in wants to really fight back against this and to really resist this coup. Now, what happens actually after the coup is that the new government carries out a reign of terror. Evidence indicates that they were handed lists of people by the United States government that they needed to kill, a lot of communists, a lot of people that Che Guevara would have known. And Che Guevara comes to a conclusion in this year, which, again, this is something that comes out all throughout the Cold War. Che Guevara comes to a conclusion in 1954 that there is no democratic, unarmed road to reform in Latin America. Even if you only want to carry out the most moderate social reform, imperialist violence will come for you. And so you have to form a more radical, defensive and hierarchical revolutionary movement, because there will be a counterattack. And so, of course, that story becomes more famous. He goes and he ends up joining the Cuban Revolution. And Guatemala descends into civil war for 30, 40 years, really.
But knowing the two facts you just mentioned, first of all, that the CIA wasn't so well organized, and second, that Che Guevara kind of got learned his lesson, we could say, or draw his conclusions from this coup in Guatemala. in the 50s. So knowing those two facts, maybe we might have already a kind of explanation why the Cuban Revolution never lost the power struggles against US interventions or possible, I don't know, counter-revolutions, coup attempts, or regime change attempts.
Yeah, I think they were prepared because they were always waiting for this, and they were lucky. I think even with a very prepared Cuban Revolution, a different type of U.S.-backed intervention than the one that was actually unleashed at the Bay of Pigs in 1961 could be conceivably effective. So they were prepared, and they were lucky enough that the U.S. the type of intervention the U.S. actually launched was stupid and weak and easy to thwart with a little bit of preparation. And then after that, for political reasons, the U.S. kind of backs off. But the U.S., if the U.S. really wanted to, they could have crushed Cuba afterwards, right? I mean, if they really, really wanted to, they could have, bombed it to the Stone Age. After the embarrassment of 1961, they held off. So Cuba was prepared, and they managed to beat the United States in the open confrontation that the U.S. government chose in 1961, and then that's why they've, I think, held on for so long.
Yeah, but it's pretty ironically that those kind of failed attempts from some stupid CIA agents kind of gave them the possibility away to do like low-profile actions, or like they kind of obligated them to just act in more kind of covered, low-profile actions in order to not pay the price of being publicly known as the guys intervening in other countries. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is a dynamic that outside of Cuba, and I'm coming to this conclusion for the first time, outside of Cuba, when they got caught, the CIA or other elements of the U.S. foreign policy apparatus, when they got caught, they could just try it again. So in Guatemala, they had several different plans, and Arbenz finds out one of them and publishes it in the newspaper, and it just doesn't matter. Like, that's the privilege you have as the clandestine foreign service of the hegemon. If you get caught, no one's going to get you in trouble, right? There's no referee for the most powerful country in the world. There's no one that's going to say, oh, you broke the rules, now you can't do that anymore. So this is why in Indonesia, they get to keep trying different things. No one in the United States is hearing about what happened in 1955 or 1958. No one knows. Guatemala, 1954, the New York Times had a reporter that was active in Guatemala who was starting to figure out what the CIA was doing. CIA calls the head of the New York Times and says, pull that reporter out of the region. Basically, he's doing too good of a job.
Yeah.
Bring him back. They do. And so you get to keep trying and trying and trying. So this is why it seems you get contradictory visions about the CIA often, not only on the left, but in popular culture. One is that they're like all powerful and whatever they decide, it happens. That's not true. They mess up all the time. But the fact that they mess up all the time doesn't mean that they're not ultimately effective, because they have the ability to keep trying, try something else. They never get in trouble. But in the case of Cuba, people really did find out about the Bay of Pigs. It was like right there. I mean, the Miami Cuban community is very strong. It's right off the coast of the United States. That was a big kind of embarrassing failure for the United States government. And for a lot of political reasons, Cold War reasons, domestic political reasons, the US chose not to go after Cuba again like that. Of course, they chose to instead try to make it an example, strangle the economy for 60 years, and hope that that would convince the world that socialism doesn't work.
Yeah. So let's go back to Indonesia. The Communist Party of Indonesia, the PKI. Or
yeah, in Indonesian it's PKI. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, they used to be a huge party. They were an unarmed communist party with many connections to the working class. Very like in favor of a national or liberal revolution. They had even like a Muslim wing inside of the party, or influence. Like they were building up a peaceful mass party, competing in elections.
Right.
So, how would you kind of characterize this party, and what was the opinion from other socialist, communist, like tendencies or countries like the Soviet Union, like maybe the Cubans or others, about this strategy, this approach, which is kind of similar to maybe France or Italy back in those days, like Eurocommunism?
Italy is Italy is the only other country that the party comes close in size. So the PCI at its height comes close to the size of the Indonesian Communist Party. It doesn't come close to winning elections, which is the main. Well, it does come close, but it doesn't. And what is important to note about the PKI in Indonesia is that we now have access to both CIA and MI6 documents that indicate that both of these organizations believed that if there were fair and free elections in Indonesia after 1958, which there weren't, the PKI would have won. So the PKI by 1965 had 3 million official members, another 20 million members that were in associated organizations. You already point to the organized working class. The feminist movement was incredibly important. This was a huge organization, the Indonesian women's movement. Cultural organizations were very important. If you were Indonesian from 1955 to 1965 and you got into art or music or theater, you probably ended up interacting a lot with the Indonesian Communist Party's Cultural Association. They were often putting on concerts everywhere. Same with teachers. So yeah, I got to the point where 25 to 35% of the country was indirectly or directly linked to the Indonesian Communist Party. And just to be clear, this is not a party that in any way is operating like the Che Guevara party. Like, this is a party where for 10 years, if you grew up in certain parts of Java or Bali, you know, probably half your teachers are in the Indonesian Communist Party, probably the mayors in the Indonesian Communist Party. They're very active in local community. There's nothing secret or violent or subversive about them. They consider themselves to be participating openly in the Indonesian Revolution under President Sukarno, in a particular type of democracy, which is always imperfect. It becomes more imperfect after 1958, but we don't need to get into that. And part of this is explained by its long history in the anti-colonial struggle. So as I said, it's a older communist party than the Chinese Communist Party. And from the beginning during the anti-colonial struggle, worked hand in hand with Muslim movements, nationalist movements, moderate forces in the nationalist struggle. And then when they chose to reincorporate themselves after the Revolutionary War, because the Dutch tried to reconquer Indonesia from 1945 to 1949, the same way that France tried to reconquer Vietnam.
They got colonized by the Dutch.
Yeah. So Indonesia, I should be clear, Indonesia is the consequence of Dutch colonialism in Southeast Asia. So Indonesia had nothing, those 12,000 or 15,000 or 18,000 islands, however you want to count it, that giant archipelago, here you can see, the only thing that brought it together as one nation was Dutch colonialism, right? So the struggle ended up generating the idea of Indonesian nationalism. The type of nationalism that they had was very different than European nationalism. It is a nationalism born out of anti-colonial struggle. So after the Revolutionary War, when the PKI decides to reincorporate itself as a moderate, unarmed party participating in elections, this is a very different strategy than the Soviet Union, and especially China has in its own history. But by this point, the Indonesian Communist Party believes that it's doing well enough that it can make its own decisions about how to be running a party. They believe that popularity is enough. Well, they bet on popularity, let's put it that way. They believe that being really present in society and being able to organize mass rallies and huge amounts of support that's their own way. It's the Indonesian approach to building socialism. And in their documents, they don't believe that they should be seizing power to create a socialist revolution in the short term. Their internal ideology is that socialism should come like in the year 2000, which back then is like forever in the future, right? So they believed that they had their own way to do it and that they didn't, that they were succeeding with their own path.
Yeah. So who was Sukarno, and like for what stood his government?
Yeah. So Sukarno is the revolutionary leader that emerges out of this anti-colonial mix that I just described. He wrote an article in, I think, 1926 called Marxism, Nationalism, and Islam, where he argues that these three elements come together in opposition to colonialism. And he is a leader which is always about pluralism and syncretism as foundational to Indonesian identity. And it must be, right? Like, it wouldn't work. I mean, Indonesia is so diverse and so large, and there's so many different languages and religions. Pluralism has to be at the foundation of the country, or else it's not going to happen. And he ends up being kind of the founding father of the country, and he is always left-leaning, never communist. goes back and forth on friendship with the West. And even his sort of, what's interesting about Sukarno is that the power of his personality and his influence as a founding father of the country was so profound that not even the Suharto dictatorship tried to get rid of it. Like every Indonesian leader after Sukarno has to recognize, like, oh, he is the founding father of the country. And he was one of the most important voices in the Third World Movement. So he was really typical of a particular type of third worldist leader in the early Cold War that was trying to carry out a sort of, in Marxist terms, like a national bourgeois revolution to construct a state. I mean, this was very... It's another thing I'd like to stress is that back then, if you were Indonesian in 1952, 53, you only have had 3 years of independence in the last 500. It's not clear exactly that this is actually going to work. This is going to last. So these movements are often self-defensive and constructed in opposition to Western power.
Yeah. So on one hand, we have the PKI, the Communist Party. Then we get this kind of Sukarno, third world nationalist, kind of progressive president who has fought for the independence and the national liberation. And there's like the third element, the military. What's their role?
Yeah, so this is a good place to get back to that story that I was telling about the various interventions from the West. You have the 1955 vote buying attempts, doesn't work. You have the Civil War, which falls apart because an American soldier is caught bombing Indonesia. And so after 1958, the United States changes its approach to the Indonesian military. Instead of going to war directly with it, they bring thousands of generals, thousands of officers to the United States for training. The idea is to form a very close relationship with the Indonesian military. And this is built on something that has worked very well in Latin America in the past. So you have this interesting dynamic emerge from 1958 to 1965, where the Indonesian military, which technically, officially, ideologically, is born out of revolutionary anti-colonial struggle, they also are forming very close ideological and logistical and financial relationships with the United States government, the United States military. The United States military is able to build kind of anti-communist ideological hegemony within the upper ranks of the armed forces. And they play a really important role in Indonesia and the Indonesian economy because of this civil war. They take on a lot of economic roles in this period. They become really one of the competing governing forces alongside Sukarno's central government and the Indonesian Communist Party, which has a lot of grassroots support. So it's if you look back on it, you can see how this is quite an explosive and unstable situation. But for a while, Sukarno kind of held things together.
Yeah, so Sukarno himself used to be in other countries, and he kind of, or Indonesians see this Kennedy presidency, and the presidency of JFK is like, he has a kind of different approach in foreign policy with respect to like third world countries, right? Can you explain us like the change under his presidency and the so-called, what is his name, the ambassador, Smiling Jones?
Yeah, Howard Jones. Yeah, Howard Jones. Yeah, so Howard Jones is an interesting character because he really is the human manifestation of these two warring spirits within the US project that I described at the beginning. On the one hand, he knows that he's supposed to crush communism everywhere. On the other hand, he's kind of like an American and believes like, oh shucks, like we believe in freedom and stuff. And so he's always really conflicted about these two sort of competing elements in his own role as ambassador to Indonesia. And so after the Civil War that the CIA gets caught participating in, he's like, in his memoirs, he says like, well, I understand at this point why Indonesia became more friendly with socialist countries, why they became more, suspicious of us. I would do the exact same thing. He's kept in as ambassador in the first few years of, well, all of the years of JFK's presidency. And so JFK, although I think it's right to put him in the same category as the rest of Cold War presidents. He's a Cold Warrior. He supports intervention all over the place. When he takes office, Sukarno and other leaders in the Third World Movement see him as a guy that, for an American, gets it more than the rest. He's come out in some moments in his political career, in JFK, saying that he understands what's going on in the Third World, why they would want to forge their own path. You know, we did the same thing.
Empathizing.
Yeah. He says, you know, look, how would we feel if, you know, right. So in the first few years of the 1960s, JFK and Sukarno maintain this kind of bumpy friendship. Like, things are back to being kind of okay again. At the same time that the military is being trained by the US, there is official diplomatic friendship between the United States and Indonesia until, of course, very famously, John F. Kennedy is assassinated in 1963.
Yeah. Interesting note in your book was that Soviet Union President, how can I pronounce his name? Khrushchev?
Yeah, Khrushchev. I don't know. In English we say Khrushchev. Khrushchev, I think, is more.
Yeah, he was kind of speculating whether Kennedy is kind of ready or has the CIA under control.
Oh yeah, this is interesting.
Funny notes.
There are some interesting.
Same with Fidel Castro. Right?
Yeah.
But you're mentioning that, I'm like really impressed how like two communist presidents are wondering whether the US deep state is going to tolerate an American president who kind of gets it. Like
no, both. Khrushchev has it's in the book. But Khrushchev has like a kind of perhaps it's one of these things like, you know, that seems too perfect in retrospect. But he has some sort of interesting quotes where he's like, oh, this Kennedy guy, I think he's going to be destroyed by the American government. Like, I don't think he's going to be able to take them on. The forces around him are too powerful, you know. And maybe that's the kind of thing where, like, you know, like that Notorious B.I.G. song where he's like, oh, the Twin Towers are going to get blown up, but really he was talking about something different. But it looks like he's like predicting the future. Maybe it's one of these, but I find it, you know, we do have this moment of Khrushchev saying like, oh, Kennedy, I don't know. And and you know, who knows exactly what happens in Dallas in 1963. But when JFK is killed, US policy towards Indonesia changes. And the mass murder in Indonesia is, I would put, one of the most important consequences of the Kennedy assassination. You would not have seen things go exactly this way if Kennedy was not killed in 1963.
Yeah, so under his presidency, they are starting the CAP, like the Civic Actions Program.
Right.
And they're kind of training lots of military in a very anti-communist way, right? So what happens then later? What happens in 58?
In 58?
Yeah.
Well, 58 was the CIA, the CIA civil war. So the CAP, which comes after, as a result of this close partnership that starts after the Civil War, is one of many ways in which the United States government encourages the Indonesian military not just to be anti-communist, but to get involved in really like building up the economy and being a modernizing force. And this is something that they tried in South Vietnam. This is all wrapped up in modernization theory, this idea that the military can be used to drag the Indonesian society or any other society in the global South, like drag it into modernity. And their idea of it's very like a teleological, it's kind of like inverse Marxism. It's kind of like, you know, like bizarro world Marxism, where history is supposed to progress to communism, but in the United States version of it, it's like history is supposed to progress to being America.
Yeah, still gets taught in sociology, even on my university.
Yeah. Like, and then like in the communism, in you know, the Marxist schematic, the engine of history is class struggle. And then in the United States, the modernization theory, the engine of history can be like whatever forces aligned with the United States just to like make it become like the United States. But it's very teleological, and it's ends up being very authoritarian in its implementation. So this is what's happening at the moment when JFK dies. The Indonesian military is already very deeply involved in the economy and has close relations with the United States.
So how did the CIA and MI6 later prorogue this kind of left-wing coup attempt?
Right.
What happened at the 30th of September? How did they prepare, and how did this success like change fundamentally the presidency of this like independent nationalist leader?
Right. So after JFK dies, Lyndon Johnson takes over, and he does not have the political, he does not want to spend political or economic capital on maintaining this relationship with Indonesia. Forces around him in Washington, D.C. are tired of Sukarno, tired of this friendship, tired of providing aid to a country that they think is not grateful enough for it. And the friendship ends. So Howard Jones, this one ambassador that I've described briefly, is removed from the country. They bring in a new ambassador, and in ways which are still mysterious. This is a part of the story we don't quite understand fully. But CIA and MI6 begin to agitate behind the scenes with the goal of creating a clash between the very well-armed Indonesian Communist Party. They begin to agitate behind the scenes to create a clash between the very well-armed Indonesian military and the very popular but unarmed Indonesian Communist Party, knowing very well what happens when an armed and unarmed group clash, right? So there's a lot of like skullduggery and lying and black propaganda and counterinformation and disinformation. A lot of like fake stories are planted around media in Southeast Asia. A lot of rumors are planted. We don't know exactly who does what. We know that MI6 is important at in this moment because they're quite good at this stuff. Whereas the early CIA was often like very well funded, but not that good at what they were doing. And in the end of September 1965, this clash is generated. The opportunity for this clash does arise. And what happens is still very mysterious as to the September 30th movement. I think you could do like a 10-part podcast series on like who really did what really was the September 30th movement, who planned it, because it's one of these things where definitionally you must do conspiracy theory. Like it's
kind of like the JFK assassination.
Yeah, the JFK assassination is, well, yeah, there's been like decades and decades of like, you can spend all your time, because in the case at least of you
can get crazy about it.
Like, you can go all the way. In the case of the September 30th movement, the only way to come to a conclusion is to form a theory about a conspiracy. So some very serious scholars have done a great job of putting together relatively convincing theories about what have happened, but we don't have all the information that would be required to come to any firm conclusions about what really happened. Do you want to get that?
Yeah, I don't know. I'll ask you another question meanwhile.
Okay.
So
he left.
Yeah. Okay. So back to this movement. So there was a huge like psychological warfare against the Communist Party in Philippines. You guys knew they're becoming more and more popular, more and more loved. Like on the long term, they're becoming a real danger, either because they might actually win elections in some years, or because like they're being tolerated by an independent government.
Mm-hmm.
He's like kind of aligning the whole third world, kind of more independent from their ideologies, but on the pragmatic issue that they are like ex-colonies, they're kind of repressed by the first and sometimes the second world. So and they're like, but we don't want to be the bad guys, so they have to start making the mistakes. So it's a kind of psychological warfare against them, and it seems to have worked.
Oh, well, they definitely, so in 63 and 64, so 64 and 65, they definitely tried to trick the left into believing that dangerous things were happening. They tried to like create like a climate of uncertainty and again, not a lot of this is clear, but they may have planted rumors about things to lead people to believe that they had to act. Again, like some of these schemes, like some of these CIA schemes are really, really wild. Like ones we know about. Like we know that in the late 50s in Los Angeles, the CIA created a sex tape, which was supposed to portray President Sukarno having sex with a Russian woman. They hired actors in Hollywood to make this because they wanted to like discredit him as a leader. They know that
So it was a fake video.
Yes, it was a video. They hired an actor.
Yeah.
In LA, a couple of actors to produce what would appear to be a sex tape. We know that they thought they looked into assassinating him. We don't know if they actually tried, but they definitely like came up with plans. And then what they were doing specifically to sort of create the conditions for a clash in 64 and 65, we don't know. What we do know is that on the morning of October 1st, it's called the September 30th movement, but really everything happens on the morning of September 1st. Some low-level officers in the army declare that they have carried out this kind of a counter coup, that they've seized, that they've arrested higher-ranking members of the military that had planned to carry out a right-wing coup. They claim that this movement, the September 30th movement, is supposed to be like restoring power to Sukarno. They do not announce what has happened to these generals, but again, this is one of the mysterious parts. The generals end up dead. So 6 of the generals that are kidnapped overnight from September 30th to October 1st end up dead. Immediately, Suharto, who is one of the generals that was not targeted, but was right-leaning and well-known to the CIA at the time, not really well-known to Indonesians. He kind of came out of nowhere. He seizes power above the head of Sukarno, so immediately violating the chain of command, and immediately he's recognized by the United States government as the de facto ruler of Indonesia. Again, all of this is very murky, because why was he not targeted by the September 30th movement? He knew some of the, he was friendly with some of the organizers of the September 30th movement. Oh, maybe they would have told him about it. Very
mysterious.
Yeah, it's all, you know, you can, like you said, you can go forever. John Roos's book, Pretext for Mass Murder, probably puts together the most coherent theory, which looks at all the documentation, but then, and like everybody in the Indonesian community can find a bunch of other ways to interpret things.
So how did the president behave in the moment when this kind of coup attempt?
Well, Sukarno tries to
how does he behave
assert control, but he
used to be very popular, but he was kind of not anymore able to balance like the Communist Party and the military, because inside of military they're like they seem to, like, this psychological warfare seemed to have like his results.
Immediately Suharto. What matters is this is things move very quickly on October 1st. Suharto seizes power, immediately recognized by the U.S., and the U.S. supplies him with communications equipment, because the most important thing that he does in this moment is propaganda. He shuts down every outlet that he does not control. And he uses every outlet that he does control to spread this fantastical, bizarre story of the Indonesian women's movement, which was associated with the Communist Party, kidnapping and performing a kind of tantric, sexual, communist, satanic orgy ritual on the generals, in which they cut off their genitalia and then shove them down a well. So immediately, they're able to tell the whole country, Suharto is, oh, the communists not only tried to overthrow the country, they carried out this horrible act, and there's the threat of the communists everywhere being violent like this. We have to crush them. We have to crush them. And at this point, Sukarno has lost a lot of his ability to influence events, because Suharto has the backing of the U.S. A lot of people believe this story, or at least something very strange is coming out of Jakarta. And then this story, this propaganda narrative, which should be emphasized, is spread with the help of Western media, knowing that it's a lie, is used to justify rounding up perhaps 2 million, we don't know the numbers precisely, members of the Indonesian Communist Party, or people associated with the party, or people accused of being associated with the party. And this dynamic, again, is really crucial, because it's similar to kind of what happened here. The Indonesian communists that go in to be arrested think that nothing's going to happen, right? Like, if 1 million people think that they're going to be murdered, they don't walk into the police station. Yeah. So the Indonesian Communist Party, because they were so well integrated into society, as I said, and a lot of people that I met reporting on this book told me, like, oh yeah, I just went down to the police station. I know I didn't do anything. I live thousands of miles from Jakarta. Like, I don't know what happened over there.
They were very confident.
They were
too confident.
Yeah, they walked in and they said, I'm going to, oh yeah, I'll give an interview. I don't know anything, whatever. But what happens instead is that about 1 million of these people remain in concentration camps for the crime of either being socialist or feminist. And another 1 million, we don't know the number precisely, were taken out and killed. And this decimation of the Indonesian Communist Party is not just done out of sort of anti-communist rage. It's not done out of this idea of this desire to crush the enemies of Suharto. It makes possible the consolidation of the Suharto government. It would be impossible for Suharto to establish himself as the dictator without the elimination of the support base for Sukarno. So the Communist Party is crushed. And then the 30-40% of the country, which is left-leaning, is either killed or terrorized into silence. And this is what makes possible the ascendance of the Suharto dictatorship.
Yeah, so maybe we can go one step back to the propaganda, the response from the now self-installing dictatorship of Suharto. So what he does is basically blaming the PKI, the Communist Party of Indonesia, for the whole September 30th movement, kind of coup attempt, and creating a huge anti-communist founding myth of Indonesia, which is very similar to Brazil, which is interesting since you have been correspondent there and you know a lot about kind of Brazilian nationalist, right-wing military myths. They seem to have similar anti-communist, anti-feminist propaganda, right?
Yeah, this and goes back to the 1930s. So an interesting point of contrast between Asia and Latin America in the Cold War is that often the US would get to a place like Indonesia and try to find the anti-communist elements within the local society, and there were none. Like, it took a very long time for the US to find anybody in Indonesia that cared about communism. They were like, yeah, well, that's one, yeah, you know, that's one of the other ideological elements in the arm, you know, in the anti-colonial struggle, whatever. Even like the conservative Muslim party that was getting funding from the CIA was saying often like, yeah, we don't view anti-communism as a good basis for friendship with the US. We don't care. Whereas in Latin America, things were very different. In Latin America, often the US would get there and realize, oh, these guys have even like more developed anti-communist rhetoric and stories and sort of rhetorical strategies than we do. We can learn from them. So in Brazil, you have a story going all the way back to 1935 about an uprising, which similarly to Indonesia, the story that gets told later is that the communists killed generals in their sleep. They sort of, you know, cowardly, this all Germany, you know, stabbed in the back kind of stuff. Like,
Dolchstoßlegende.
Yeah. It's like they tried to, in a cowardly way, kill our heroic, patriotic generals. That was all, of course, all made up. It was like that's not how you do an uprising in the 30s. But yeah, this story that Suharto spreads with U.S. assistance in 1966 is like really a good one. It's really well crafted. We still don't know like who made it up and how long they'd been planning to do this. If they came up with it pretty quickly, or if this was a plan that had been in their back pocket for a long time. But we do know that it was used to round up and then kill. Somewhere between, you know, the range is 500,000 to 3 million. I think it's 1 million is a pretty good guess. But precisely the reason that we don't know a number is that there's never been any kind of a careful, in-depth investigation of the type that you do have in Germany, of the type that you do have in Cambodia, of the type that you do have in Latin America. No one ever went back and asked.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still mass graves everywhere. I mean, nobody... It's absurd that we have to guess how many people were killed.
Yeah, really crazy. And I mean, it's still very anti-communist country, Indonesia nowadays. So it's still, people still, are not allowed to tell the truth or their version of the history. They just know this kind of myth. So, but what happened with President Sukarno after this kind of self-coup and the pretext of the fight against the coup happened, which is kind of remembering myself to some recent successes in Latin America.
Right.
But anyways,
yeah, he was sidelined. He lost real power, and then finally, officially on March 1966, power was transferred to Suharto. But from October 1st, 1965,
like half a year later.
No, like 8 months or what is this? Yeah, October. Yeah, half a year later. And he spends the rest of his life sort of, you know, a very like diminished figure in Indonesia. You know, there's all kinds of debates as to whether or not he or the Indonesian Communist Party or somebody else should have, you know, mounted some kind of a more vigorous defense to what was happening in 1965. I think that those discussions went on forever in the Asian left afterwards. But it really came quickly, and the Indonesian Communist Party at least had no preparation, none of the infrastructure that would have been required to put together something like that.
Were there any debates about the armed struggle inside of the Communist Party or from other communist tendencies or countries around in the world?
Well, Mao kind of warned them a couple times. Mao believed that
he met with whom? With Sukarno's president or with the president of the Communist Party of the PKI?
Well, yeah. No, so the meeting that I'm referring to is with Aidit, the leader of the Communist Party.
Yeah.
He believed that they couldn't trust sort of national bourgeois forces, and he was recounting a story from the history of the Chinese Communist Party going back to 1927, when nationalists sort of massacre communists in Shanghai. I think it's 26 or 27. And he kind of warned Aidit, and there was kind of discussions, okay, perhaps we can form sort of a people's militia, but it was moving very slowly. And also the discussion about forming a people's militia could have been the thing that helped to make the Indonesian military react. So they were kind of locked into the strategy that they had chosen, a decade before, which was betting on mass popularity and just numbers.
Yeah, and mass popularity is not building up a revolutionary movement. It's a mass party that depends on its popularity.
Yeah,
yeah,
and they didn't.
I mean, it wouldn't be very easy to start arming a peaceful mass party.
No, it would have been incredible. I mean, like I said, the people, like this was, this kind of. You can read an autocriticism, a self-criticism that's written by some elements of the party that was published, I think, in China a few years later. But this is who is that? Who wrote it? It would have been only a couple, members that managed to survive and made it to China. But at least as far as August 1965 goes, the people that I met through this book, they were people that wanted to be school teachers. They were people that were had a job at the post office. It was, it would have been very wild to say, okay, everybody now report for training. We're going to give you weapons that we don't have under the nose of a very, let's say, a superpower, which is very easy to provoke.
Yeah.
The United States was not known for being very calm in the face of a mass party taking up arms. So this was something that was just not really the way that they viewed their role.
But having chosen the strategy of a democratic revolution, they might have at least tried to build up constitutionalist forces as they existed in maybe Chalene military.
Oh no, well this existed. I mean, this existed too. There were some elements of the Indonesian military which were less right wing than others. And this is again there's all endless discussions on this point as to which of the branches of the armed forces were the most right wing and most aligned with the United States, and which branches of the armed forces might have been. So the Air Force was
just always the most strategic one.
Yeah, it was except in the inside. Except when you live in the sphere of effective U.S. hegemony, because the U.S. just controls your skies no matter what. Yeah. So there was a bit, but yeah, there wasn't a big push for this. And again, in Brazil, this is kind of what helped to cause the coup, is that without even any good reason, some elements within the Brazilian military believed that Jango, the Brazilian president, was making direct appeals to lower ranking soldiers, and that they were, he was going to radicalize the officer class or something. So, yeah, it was, it's like I said, by 1960. So that's why I always say that if you want to figure out a way that things could have gone differently and things could have been less horrible, you can't start in 1965. You would have to rerun the entire 10-year period up to 1965. And ideally, as a U.S. citizen, I would have liked to rerun that without the kind of intense and repeated intervention which distorts the nature of Indonesian democracy.
Yeah. So what happened probably the first time in an Asian country was that they forcefully disappeared hundreds of thousands of people.
Right.
So what was the reason for them to not just kill them directly or take them away and tell them your family got killed or whatever, why did they disappear then? Which effect has this
Mhm.
kind of disappearance on the victims and their families and friends and
Yeah.
comrades?
Yeah,
etc.?
this dynamic is very familiar in the Western Hemisphere. Most people in Latin America or even the US know about the disappeared, desaparecidos. And it's clear now why it works so well. It's because the natural human, it's a very horrible thing. The natural human tendency is to believe, against all evidence, that your relative, that your son, that your brother, that your husband, that your daughter is still alive. If you don't get confirmation, you're still going to hold on to some hope. And this hope paralyzes potential resistance to authoritarian consolidation, because you're not going to take up arms or rebel or start burning down police stations in the street if you think that this thing is going to be the thing that gets your relative killed. So the first time, as you mentioned, the first time that historians believe that mass disappearances were used in the Cold War was 1965 in Indonesia. The first time that they're used in Latin America is 1966. There is a transfer of U.S. personnel from Southeast Asia to Latin America in those years. So it's very possible that this would have been another case where they looked and saw, oh, that worked over there. Let's try this over here.
Yeah. So, how did mainstream media kind of not cover this bloody massacres up, or how did they paint it in?
So it was a combination of things. There was not like a blackout. There was not like censorship. It was more like they twisted the reality of who was carrying out the violence. It was blamed on sort of like inscrutable Asian tendencies to mass murder. Like, oh, the people of Indonesia have run amok. They've sort of, there's this irrational mass irrational episode of mass violence, which was, of course, both racist and wrong. It was coordinated. It's, you can't kill that many people out of, that many people is very hard to kill. It was coordinated by the military. There were often death squads that carried out the actual murder. One of them very famously was inspired by Nazi violence here in Germany.
Okay.
Yeah, they're like one of the groups of the youth movements that ends up working as a death squad takes on the name Banzer, and the reason he picks Banzer is because it rhymes with Panzer, because the leader of Banzer is reading Mein Kampf, and he thinks it's really like really helpful. And then the other thing that they do in the Western press is that they celebrate it, like, oh well, this is great, this is a big victory in Asia. All these other places where we're losing, we've just won. And, from a pure, cold, cynical, evil perspective, they were right. Like, this was a relatively costless flip of a huge piece of the puzzle in the Cold War. So the New York Times has a famous column that's a gleam of light in Asia. It's like, oh, look, here's a little bit of good news coming from that part of the world.
So this, like, Anso and Banzer is like, what kind of political organization was it? What was their ideology?
Oh, this was
apart from being anti-communist.
No, well, this one. So this one, Banzer is a Muslim organization. It's the youth wing of NU. But there are all kinds of different organizations across Indonesia which carry out the actual killing, and this varies from place to place. In Bali, it would have been very different than Sumatra. Central Java would have been very different than East Java. Jakarta, you had an entirely different dynamic. But there were sometimes religious organizations, sometimes just conservative political organizations. Often, like, these details are not, I don't like to concentrate on them in the book, because I try to talk more about global forces and the way that history took a different path than it could have. But the actual mechanics of murdering an innocent person present real challenges. People don't want to do this.
Yeah.
So often they would press kind of outlaw, like kind of like marginal elements of Indonesian society, like kids or like criminals or kind of like homeless,
obligate people to kill other people,
and press them into doing it. Threaten them that if they didn't do it, that they were going to be in trouble. Tell them that it was their patriotic duty or whatever, but like make them do it. and then like give them a bunch of like get them, you know, drunk or give them some cheap sort of kind of like alcohol, including in the Muslim parts of the country, to make it possible to carry this out.
And they use this kind of this term kind of witch for the feminists in order to legitimate violations, saying that like being a communist and a feminist is a sin against their religion, and this kind of justified not just the killing but as well mass violations.
Yeah, they associated, well, they, as I said, they blamed the worst stuff on the women's movement, because this is a classic tactic, you know. If you really want to get conservative, insecure men like fired up, you should tell them that, you know, evil witches are going to come for them, right? And then they really pressed this message that the communists were atheists or satanic or opposed to the very idea of Indonesia itself. So there was all these kind, you know, it takes a lot. It's really, really, again, I don't concentrate on the dynamics of this, partially because the movie The Act of Killing is so good on this. But the dynamics of actually murdering that many people are it's very difficult to do. US soldiers were not going to be out there doing that. Not even Indonesian soldiers wanted to be out there actually strangling people and throwing them into rivers. They often would get local sort of like youth, you know, again, like who does the most messed up stuff in any society? It's like young men like on drugs, right? Like, so they pressed sort of criminal elements into carrying out the really dirty work for them, because no one wants to do that.
Yeah. So, what do you think? Why was it that the Communist Party in Indonesia wasn't being tolerated? Meanwhile, maybe in Italy they were kind of tolerated. I mean, there was Operation Gladio, Stay Behind Armies, but why didn't they tolerate it in Indonesia?
Well, this, you know, Francesca, who ends up being kind of the hero of the book, or at least the protagonist, she has a very simple explanation for this, because she spent all of her life in as a citizen of the Dutch colonial empire, and her husband is killed, and then she moves to Europe afterwards, and she sees like, oh, in Europe they're allowed to have communist parties. And her explanation is like, well, this is racism. This is colonial. There's different rules for white people in the first world than there are for brown people in the third world. They let people in the first world get away with more than they let us get away with. That's her very simple answer. And I think that's a huge part of it. I think that Western Europe was able to be maintained as part of the US-led global order without this kind of type of horrible intervention. So the US was, you know, they didn't love the PCI or the PCF. They didn't want them to be doing as well as they often were. But France and Italy remained broadly in the Western camp. They weren't going to try to disrupt, you know, they weren't going to try to disrupt the nature of the global order. So it was more tolerable.
Yeah. So racism played a huge role in it. So, which is kind of a colonial heritage from the whole colonial times. Very interesting fact. And on the other hand, like European countries are pretty much integrated into international markets. So
yeah,
if like any communist would overtake, what do you think what would have happened? Like,
yeah, I mean, certainly there was no popular leader of Italy that was actually running the country that wanted to change the rules of the global system. That would have pushed things over the line.
Like,
I think
maybe communists weren't that much of a threat there. Like, at
well, yeah,
least for the global system.
I mean, yeah, this dynamic, this is an entirely different story about like including like the line coming from the Soviet Union, which often took a more sort of realpolitik approach to revolution in Western Europe, often just kind of treating it like, after a certain point, the Soviet Union kind of decides like, we're not going to mess with US territory because the US is crazy. Like, yeah, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis, but really in the early world years of the Cold War, including people like Stalin, who of course is not like shy about using violence if he feels it's the right thing. A lot of Soviet leaders come to the conclusion that like, oh, we can't really mess with US territory because they will react like hard. So he takes a more sort of traditional realpolitik approach to spheres of influence and revolution and things. And again, this kind of tends to be this is kind of the way that the Soviet Union approaches Indonesia too in 1963 to 65. Brezhnev doesn't like the way that Sukarno is causing a lot of trouble in the region. Brezhnev is like a little bit annoyed by Sukarno's constant confrontation with Western powers, because this causes a lot of problems for them. The Soviet Union becomes more conservative on the international front. Well, that's an entirely different story of the left, but this is why Guevarist and Maoist movements become popular in Latin America in the 60s, because the Soviet Union is kind of like, oh my God.
Yeah, it's really interesting how like the respect from the Soviet Union for the US kind of led to the Soviet Union having a very moderate approach. Meanwhile, the Cubans, as a tiny island over there, they're very like aggressive, supporting armed struggles. Like,
yeah.
Anyways, so yeah, what do you think? Which role played the World Anti-Communist League back in those days, and which role does it still play nowadays?
Oh well, so this process that I described, this learning that takes place across various countries, where one thing doesn't work here, so they try something here, that works here, so they try it there. That is often facilitated not only by the US government, but these formal anti-communist organizations like the World Anti-Communist League, the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations. A lot of explicitly anti-communist international movements, which allow for sort of the transfer of technology and personnel and funding and things. So the World Anti-Communist League is important for this reason. It allowed for sort of networking and for the transfer of assistance and advice, essentially. World Anti-Communist League now I don't think plays a very big role. I don't know. I don't even know. I don't know where do they still. They might still exist on paper somewhere. I'm not sure. I don't know. Do they?
Yeah. They actually.
Yeah. But it was
especially in Mexico. I think they have like a local Latin American section.
Oh well, this group is interesting. Yeah, this group is interesting. And then you have the resurgence of one of these groups in Brazil during Bolsonarista government as well. But it's not like, it used to have like really kind of like really global reach and support of the US. It operates differently now, I think.
Yeah, what I really loved about the book was the line you draw between Indonesia and Brazil, and through Brazil, whole Latin America, how Jakarta came to Latin America during Plan Condor and the forced disappearances there, and all the similarities, the exchange that happened through US soldiers, through agents, embassies, etc. And I really felt remembered to Latin American anti-communism when I read like the book and kind of remembered their logic in order to paint the left as the evil, which is killing you, and the witches, like women as witches, and it was kind of wow.
Yeah, I mean so that's where Jakarta comes in 1970. So after Socialist President Salvador Allende is elected democratically in Chile, the word Jakarta is used at the same time in two different countries. In Brazil, it is used behind the scenes. Operação Jakarta or Operation Jakarta is a term that is circulated in the military for the possible extermination of the Brazilian Communist Party. And although it is not fully implemented, this Operação Jakarta, probably its most famous victim, according to a Brazilian colleague that just published a new study, was probably Lula's brother. Lula's brother was probably targeted in the kind of aborted Operação Jakarta. He was in the Brazilian Communist Party. But then in Chile, Jakarta is used in a very public way. It shows up in graffiti on the walls of the Capitol, and postcards are sent to leftists, employees of the government, supporters of the government, with the message just Jakarta, or sometimes Jakarta is coming. And the message was very clear if you were paying attention to the Cold War at the time, and the message was, we're going to kill you like the Indonesian communists were killed. And this is eventually what happens. Allende overthrown in the coup in 1973. Jakarta does come to Chile. And then Brazil and Chile get together to form Operation Condor. Operation Condor member countries kill tens of thousands of people across South America. And then in Central America, when those countries become the perceived problem region for the United States government once more, Operation Condor officials go to Central America to explain how to implement Plan Jakarta.
Yeah, so many German ex-Nazis went there as well, and even sometimes got paid by German secret agencies in order to train those military ships in Latin America in how to torture from the experiences in the concentration camps in Germany. And there are some involvements of ex-SS Obersturmbannführer in supporting the dictatorship in Indonesia as well.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on the German role, but this book, the German edition of the book, has a section at the end which outlines the German participation in Indonesia in 1965. And yeah, there was a former SS officer that apparently had arrived in Indonesia in 1959 that became an important propagandist for
Rudolf Epser-Röder.
Yeah, he ends up becoming like a correspondent, essentially. That's my job, really, in Indonesia, and ends up doing his best to promote the image of Suharto around the world.
Yeah. So, how did the FRG, so the capitalist part of Germany, support the Suharto dictatorship?
So this picture is coming together in pieces. They just launched a small inquiry here. I mean, I was at the Bundestag yesterday, speaking with some of the politicians that have been trying to figure out exactly what happened. What we know so far is that West Germany eventually becomes a close, like the rest of the West, ends up becoming an ally of Indonesia. We know that from the very beginning, that West Germany had knowledge of the mass killings that were being carried out. We know that they were closely informed from the very beginning. And then we have a document that comes from one Indonesian general requesting direct funds, and direct meaning directly to the military, not to the state, to assist in carrying out these anti-communist activities. What we don't have is whether or not, so the response to this request is still classified. Now, if you want to be, take a step,
in Germany,
huh?
Like in Germany.
Yeah, in Germany. So if you want to,
could declassify it.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So if you want to, if you want
government,
to be, if you want to be, what I mean is, like, if you want to be a little bit just a little bit conspiratorial, you might guess, well, if the answer was no, they would declassify it, So
yeah, or
one
maybe
journalist,
there's a member of parliament who can write and ask for it, or maybe somebody.
No, they have earlier this year. But I mean, there's an article that I tweeted out yesterday that sort of outlines, that comes to the conclusion that probably they did give this money
or weapon apart from the propaganda.
Yeah, money or material assistance to the Indonesian military during the mass murder. Now, my personal feeling, not based on in-depth analysis of the West German documentation, is that the United States was the most important foreign actor. Germany kind of went along with what was happening. We know from declassified files from the U.S. State Department that the Indonesian military did what it did to a large extent because of what it believed the United States wanted them to do. So this dynamic is quite crucial. You don't have, U.S. soldiers carrying out the murder. Certainly not. What you have is an Indonesian military that believes they will be rewarded for doing this. The United States government knows that the Indonesian military believes that they will be rewarded, and they allow them to continue believing this, and then they reward them. So it's a kind of a it's a pretty clear understanding that has been established. And then later, a much more obvious piece of evidence comes out when one of the employees of the U.S. Embassy in Indonesia brags or admits to the Washington Post that he handed lists of communists and other targets to the Indonesian military so that they could cross them off by killing them and then report back to the American military like, oh yeah, we got them. So,
and that's probably the most efficient way to help them, since they don't have such a access of like monitoring the left and the communists, but they know how to kill them. Like, it's a very efficient way.
Yeah, I mean,
a very dangerous way. This way of giving information to those dictatorships.
Yeah, I mean, there's some like, by 1965, the Indonesian military didn't need more guns. I mean, there was an obvious asymmetry of recourse to violence between the Indonesian military and the Communist Party. They weren't like at war. They didn't need, tanks or whatever. They just needed to understand what was wanted of them. They needed to have an idea of how they would be rewarded if they did it, and they needed some information as to who exactly they should go after.
So, in order to resume, what would you say, how would you describe the way the US kind of made Indonesia and Brazil and other countries in the so-called third world their allies?
Yeah, so the conclusion that I come to in this book is not only that this happened, that the Jakarta Method, or the intentional mass murder of leftists, was a very important part of the way that the U.S. established the particular type of global capitalist system that we now live in today. So many other mechanisms were used in the Cold War to shape outcomes in the global South. But I think that to really understand the particular type of global capitalist system that ends up being formed, you need to understand what this did and how important it was, not only in shaping individual societies. I mean, much of what the dictatorships did in these 23 countries has still not been undone. There's still the unresolved trauma. There's still the ways in which these countries have a particular type of capitalism due to the anti-communist and violent nature of these regimes. But in addition to that, the very nature of the global system, the type of relations between the first and third world that we have inherited to this day after the end of the Cold War. I think the Cold War ends not because of this. The Cold War ends because the leadership of the Soviet Union destroys the Soviet Union on accident. That's ultimately why the U.S. wins the Cold War, is because the Soviet Union destroys itself. But this is an important part of the way that victory is constructed and the world that we are left living in now afterwards.
Yeah. So how was today's anti-communism in Latin America and Asia shaped by this success?
Yeah, so I mean, I've lived more in Sao Paulo, Brazil than anywhere else in the last 13 years. And unfortunately, in that country, this book became a lot more relevant in recent years than it was when I started working on it. You had the return of a far-right movement, Bolsonarismo, led by Jair Bolsonaro, who celebrated the legacy of anti-communist violence in the 20th century. He very famously said on television once that Brazil did not kill enough people, that 20 or 30,000 more people would need to be killed for Brazil to move forward. If innocent people were killed, that would all be fine. He really built his ideological project on this idea of the phantom of the communist traitor, the internal enemy. We were stabbed, again, the same myth of being stabbed in the back by the left, that every time that that Brazil fails, it's because the left is sabotaging us everywhere. Very fortunately, he did not have the means to consolidate the type of authoritarian government that he obviously wanted to construct. He failed at all of his attempts to organize an effective coup. He lost. He's now in the United States. Of course, he's in the United States. They always go to the United States. Is he still there? He went to the United States. I don't know if he's there, like at the time of airing this interview, but of course he went to the United States immediately after losing. And the reason I think that he drew upon these sort of 20th century discourses and this kind of rhetoric that paints communism as an imminent diabolical threat is because it works. It worked in the 20th century and it worked for him.
Yeah, and those countries never had a clear rupture with
No.
the structures of the military dictatorship. So the ground is fertile
Right.
for fascism, and yeah, here we are.
Here we are.
This is where we are.
Here we are.
Yeah, another fact, like we had Niklas Franzen here twice. I
Yeah,
don't know
of
whether
course.
you know
Yeah,
him.
yeah, I do. Of course. He helped. He wrote a very early review of this book, which helped this book to get published.
Oh.
Actually, yeah.
Wow, really cool. No, because he kind of recommended it, and he wrote his own book about like Bolsonaristas. So he was kind of interested into the topic. So greetings to him.
Yeah. No, you know, I was really happy to see his book like get a lot of interest here too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. So maybe one last question, since we're already talking for soon 1.5 hours. What did victims and persons involved in leftist movements of Indonesia tell you when you asked the perfect question, what their dreams, their hopes, their visions for Indonesia were the years before the coup and the military dictatorship?
Yeah, this was one of the most emotional parts of the research and also the book, because it would have been very easy to just like ask about torture and murder,
which
and
other
violence.
people ask all the time.
Yeah, and I didn't want to do a book like that. This tends to be what people focus on. I was more interested
Like
in
those were bad. Like it's what like low level like propaganda journalism, whatever it does. If you want to like do something on the right side, you're kind of having this discourse, they're evil.
Yeah,
But you're not always getting like a new point of view or a new consciousness. Like you're just making your point. Like
there's like a famous there's like famous jokes, and there's a book whose name is I won't even like reproduce right now because it's so offensive. But the joke at the heart of this discourse in foreign correspondence is that like the easiest thing to do is to show up in some country, find out who speaks English and who has been horribly violated or abused somehow, and just get that story. So I didn't want to do torture porn. I didn't want to do a book about, you know, being, you know, corporeal punishment in a prison system. I really wanted to know, what was it that you were trying to build in the 50s and 60s? Why did you believe it was possible? And what happened to this dream? And it ended up being very emotional, because these people, even though they've often spent decades in concentration camps, lost a lot of their friends and family, still live in poverty, still told by the Indonesian state that they deserved what happened to them, still never denied the basic truth or any kind of justice. When they would talk about the 50s and 60s, when they would talk about the third world movement, their eyes would light up, right? Like they would start to get excited again, just thinking about what they used to believe the world was going to be like, just thinking about what they believed that they were building in the 50s and 60s, because they believed, quite, you know, understandably, that it was natural that after the end of formal colonialism in the global South, these intelligent, talented, powerful masses of people that had been repressed by formal colonialism would be able to take their rightful place alongside the first and second worlds. That was what the third world movement was all about. It was not about third being below. It was about third world being next. 1, 2, 3. And the belief was that, okay, well, now that we're in charge of our own countries, we will rise alongside the first and second worlds. And this is what got them often more emotionally charged than the discussions about all of the horrible things that happened.
Yeah. Wonderful. Do you have any other message you want to tell our audience to finish, or do you think we told everything?
No, I think it's great. I think I just thank anybody and thank you for having any interest in like these historical questions. I think like it's not obvious why they're important until you start to look into them, and I think when you do, it becomes clear that understanding of this type of history is quite important to living in our world today, and to thinking about the ways that we can act upon our own system to make it better. So no, I'm just grateful for any interest that there still is in this book, you know, 6 years after I started working on it.
Yeah, I want to compliment you on it. I actually enjoyed a lot reading the German version on it. In German, you can call it die Jakarta-Methode, wie ein mörderisches Programm Washingtons, unsere Welt, bis heute prägt. Right now, you in Papi Rosa Verlag, they published it. You're here in order to present the German version. Here we got the English-speaking one. I think we can put the link to buy it into the description box. And this book got published in other languages as well?
Yeah, a lot. It's
Which
like
languages?
15, 16, 17 languages now. Yeah, a lot of them.
I think very interesting for the Global South, especially Latin America.
Yeah, it's in Spanish. It's in 2 different Portuguese editions, one for Africa and Europe, one for Brazil, Arabic, Persian, Chinese, Japanese, Indonesian. Yeah, I've been really, really lucky to see it be translated so many different languages.
Awesome. So thank you very much, dear Vincent, for having been here and having answered all the questions we had for you.
All right. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for reading the book with with such care.
It was a pleasure. So.
Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Wenn euch dieses Video gefallen hat, klickt auf Like, abonniert den Kanal und vergesst nicht das Glöckchen zu drücken, damit ihr benachrichtigt werdet, wenn wir neuen Content droppen.
Außerdem solltet ihr uns überall folgen, wo wir verfügbar sind. Das ist Facebook, Instagram, Twitter und Twitch. Und wenn wir irgendwelche Ankündigungen machen oder Posts, dann shared, was das Zeug hält. Gebt uns all eure Liebe.
Wir haben mittlerweile ziemlich signifikante Kosten. Wenn ihr es euch irgendwie leisten könnt, unterstützt uns doch auf Patreon. Dann kommt ihr auch in den Genuss verschiedener Vorteile, wie zum Beispiel Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community oder Zugang zu den ultrageheimen Patreon-Episoden, die wir dort posten. Außerdem könnt ihr uns natürlich auch über PayPal Spenden zukommen lassen.
Außerdem haben wir mittlerweile einen eigenen Online-Shop. Das heißt, wenn ihr euch immer noch fragt, was ihr euren Lieben zu Weihnachten, Ostern oder sonst wie schenken könnt, geht dorthin und kauft duftes Merch.
Alle Links dazu hier in der Beschreibung oder auch auf unserer Webseite 99zu1.de.
Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein, danke für die Unterstützung und wir sehen uns in diesem Theater.